It's pretty close.
It's another day. Children come and play with chocolate butter.
Chocolate butter.
The sun is out today. I'll say hello today to chocolate button.
Chocolate butter.
I'll teach you how to read and write. Not sure I can ride a bike. We'll go through all the letters and sounds, having lots of fun playing around. It's another day. Children come and play with chocolate butter.
Chocolate butter.
The sun is out today. I'll say hello today to chocolate butter. Chocolate butter.
2, 3. Chocolate butter. Good morning, Mr. Magpie.
Good morning, I in the garden. Bye. I like that.
Hello everyone, thank you so much for saving me. Oh my goodness me, it's so good to be back. And I have got time to do a story, one last story for our time in reception. And here it is, it's called George's Marvellous Medicine. And if you look, marvellous, if you take off the dicen of medicine, then it says Marvellous Me. And Marvellous Me is kind of our theme for the week because I want you to realise how brilliant you all are and for you to be able to tell your new teacher in year 1 when you come back to school in September how brilliant and marvellous you are. Okay, so the first way you can tell other people how brilliant you are is to think about it yourselves. Okay, so we're going to read this and we're going to be thinking all the time about all the marvellous things about ourselves as well as all the marvellous things about this brilliant story. Now, I believe this is one of Shirley's absolute favourites, so this is also for Shirley. So I hope you enjoy it and I hope Shirley enjoys it too. Okay, so this is called George's Marvellous Medicine and it's by Roald Dahl and it's illustrated by Quentin Blake. And the publisher is a bird. It ought to be really, shouldn't it, for our last one. It's a bird and it's Puffin, so it's published by Puffin. So thank you very much to Roald Dahl and to Puffin for giving us, and to Quentin Blake for giving us permission to read this story during the lockdown when we couldn't read it all together in class. Okay, let's get going. So we've got here our characters. So we've got George Cranky, Mr. Killy Cranky, Mrs. Cranky, and Grandma. It says George's Marvellous Medicine, illustrated by Quentin Blake, by Roald Dahl, and published by Puffin. So here's the contents again. So here we've got all the different chapters in the story and then what's going to happen in each one, so that if you stop reading and then you need to go back to where you were, you can come and use the contents and find out roughly where you were. Ooh, it starts off with this. It says, warning to readers, do not try to make George's Marvellous Medicine yourselves at home. It could be dangerous. Okay, did you hear that? Do not try to make it at home because it's very dangerous. Right, okay, off we go. Chapter 1. Chapter 1. Grandma. I'm going shopping in the village, George's mother said to George on Saturday morning. So be a good boy and don't get up to mischief. This was a silly thing to say to a small boy at any time. It immediately made him wonder what sort of mischief he might get up to. And don't forget to give Grandma her medicine at 11 o'clock, the mother said. Then out she went, closing the back door behind her. Grandma, who was dozing in her chair by the window, opened one wicked little eye and said, "Now you heard what your mother said, George. Don't forget my medicine." "No, Grandma," George said. "And just try to behave yourself for once while she's away." "Yes, Grandma," George said. George was bored to tears. He didn't have a brother or a sister. His father was a farmer, and the farm they lived on was miles away from anywhere, so there were never any children to play with. He was tired at staring at pigs and hens and cows and sheep. He was especially tired of having to live in the same house as that grizzly old grunion of a grandma. Oh my goodness, that's not very nice. Looking after her all by himself was hardly the most exciting way to spend a Saturday morning. "You can make me a nice cup of tea for a start," Grandma said to George. "That'll keep you out of mischief for a few minutes." "Yes, Grandma," George said. George couldn't help disliking Grandma. She was a selfish, grumpy old woman. She had pale brown teeth and a small puckered-up mouth like a dog's bottom. Oh my goodness me, this is a bit rude. "How much sugar in your tea today, Grandma?" George asked her. "1 spoon," she said, "and no milk." Most grandmothers are lovely, kind, helpful old ladies, but not this one. She spent all day and every day sitting in her chair by the window, and she was always complaining, grousing, grouching, grumbling, griping about something or other. Never once, even on her best days, had she smiled at George and said, "How are you this morning, George?" Or, "Why don't you and I have a game of snakes and ladders?" Or, "How was school today?" She didn't seem to care about other people, only about herself. She was a miserable old grouch. George went into the kitchen and made Grandma a cup of tea with a tea bag. He put 1 spoon of sugar in it and no milk. He stirred the sugar well and carried the cup into the living room. Grandma sipped her tea. "It's not sweet enough," she said. "Put more sugar in it." George took the cup back into the kitchen and added another spoonful of sugar. He stirred it again and carried it carefully into Grandma. "Where's the saucer?" she said. "I won't have a cup of tea without a saucer." George fetched her the saucer. "And what about a teaspoon, if you please?" "I've stirred it for you, Grandma. I stirred it well." "I'll stir my own tea, thank you very much," she said. "Fetch me a teaspoon." George fetched her a teaspoon. When George's mother or father were home, Grandma never ordered George about like this. It was only when she had him on her own that she began treating him badly. "You know what's the matter with you?" the old woman said, staring at George over the rim of the teacup with those bright, wicked little eyes. "You're growing too fast. Boys who grow too fast become stupid and lazy." "But I can't help it if I'm growing fast, Grandma," George said. "Of course you can," she snapped. "Growing's a nasty, childish habit." "But we have to grow, Grandma. If we didn't grow, we'd never be grown-ups." "Rubbish, boy, rubbish," she said. "Look at me. Am I growing? Certainly not." "But you did once, Grandma." "Only very little," the old woman answered. "I gave up growing when I was extremely small, along with all the other nasty childish habits like laziness and disobedience and greed and sloppiness and untidiness and stupidity. You haven't given up on any of these things, have you?" "I'm still only a little boy, Grandma." "You're 8 years old," she snorted. "That's old enough to know better. If you don't stop growing soon, it'll be too late." "Too late for what, Grandma?" It's ridiculous, she went on. You're nearly as tall as me already. George took a good look at Grandma. She certainly was a very tiny person. Her legs were so short she had to have a footstool to put her feet on, and her head only came halfway up the back of the armchair. Daddy says it's fine for a man to be tall, George said. Don't listen to your daddy, Grandma said. Listen to me. But how do I stop myself growing? George asked her. Eat less chocolate, Grandma said. Does chocolate make you grow? It makes you grow the wrong way, she snapped. Up instead of down. Grandma sipped some tea but never took her eyes from the little boy who stood before her. Never grow up, she said. Always down. Yes, Grandma. And stop eating chocolate. Eat cabbage instead. Cabbage? Oh, no, I don't like cabbage, George said. It's not what you like and what you don't like, Grandma snapped. It's what's good for you that counts. From now on, you must eat cabbage 3 times a day. Mountains of cabbage. And if it's got caterpillars in it, so much the better. Ouch, George said. Caterpillars give you brains, the old woman said. Mummy washes them down the sink, George said. Mummy's as stupid as you are, Grandma said. Cabbage doesn't taste of anything without a few boiled caterpillars in it. Slugs, too. Oh, not slugs, George cried out. I couldn't eat slugs. Whenever I see a slug on a piece of lettuce, Grandma said, I gobble it up quick before it crawls away. Delicious. She squeezed her lips together tight so that her mouth became a tiny wrinkled hole. Delicious, she said again. Worms and slugs and beetly bugs. You don't know what's good for you. Oh, you're joking, Grandma. I never joke, she said. Beetles are perhaps the best of all. They go crunch. Grandma, that's beastly. The old hag grinned, showing those pale brown teeth. Sometimes, if you're lucky, she said, you get a beetle inside the stem of the stick of celery. That's what I like. Grandma, how could you? You find all sorts of nice things in sticks of raw celery, the old woman went on. Sometimes it's earwigs. I don't want to hear about it, cried George. A big fat earwig is very tasty, Grandma said, licking her lips. But you've got to be very quick, my dear. When you put one of those in your mouth, it has a pair of sharp nippers on its back end, and it grabs your tongue with those and never lets go. So you've got to bite the earwig first, chop chop, before it bites you. George started edging towards the door. He wanted to get away as far as possible from this filthy old woman. You're trying to get away from me, aren't you? She said, pointing a finger straight at George's face. You're trying to get away from Grandma. Little George stood by the door, staring at the little old hag in the chair. She stared back at him. Could it be, George wondered, that she was a witch? He had always thought witches were only in fairy tales, but now he was not so sure. Come closer to me, little boy, she said, beckoning to him with a horny finger. Come closer to me and I will tell you secrets. George didn't move. Grandma didn't move either. I know a great many secrets, she said, and suddenly she smiled. It was a thin, icy smile, the kind a snake might make just before it bites you. Come over here to Grandma, and she'll whisper secrets to you. George took a step backwards, edging closer to the door. You mustn't be frightened of your old Grandma, she said, smiling that icy smile. George took another step backwards. Some of us, she said, and all at once she was leaning forward in her chair and whispering in a sort of voice George had never heard her use before. Some of us, she said, have magic powers, that can twist the creatures of this earth into wondrous shapes. A tingle of electricity flashed down the length of George's spine. He began to feel frightened. Some of us, the old woman went on, have fire on our tongues and sparks in our bellies and wizardry in the tips of our fingers. Some of us know secrets that would make your hair stand straight up on end and your eyes pop out of their sockets. George wanted to run away, but his feet seemed stuck to the floor. We know how to make your nails drop off and teeth grow out of your fingers instead. George began to tremble. It was her face that frightened him most of all, the frosty smile, the brilliant, unblinking eyes. We know how to have you wake up in the morning with a long tail coming out from behind you. Grandma, he cried, stop! We know secrets, my dear, about dark places where dark things live and squirm and slither all over each other. George made a dive for the door. It doesn't matter how far you run, he heard her saying. You won't ever get away. George ran into the kitchen, slamming the door behind him. Whew! My goodness, that was a bit scary, Lucy. It was, wasn't it? My goodness me. How did you find it? I do not want to meet Grandma ever. I wonder what's going to happen. Oh, dear me. Whew. Right, let's see what happens in the next chapter. Chapter 2. The Marvellous Plan. George sat himself down at the table in the kitchen. He was shaking a little. Oh, how he hated Grandma! He really hated that horrid old witchy woman. And all of a sudden he had a tremendous urge to do something about her. Something whopping. Something absolutely terrific. A real shocker. A sort of explosion. He wanted to blow away the witchy smell that hung about her in the next room. He may have only been 8 years old, but he was a brave little boy. He was ready to take this old woman on. I'm not going to be frightened by her, he said softly to himself. But he was frightened, and that's why he wanted suddenly to explode her away. Well, not quite away, but he did want to shake the old woman up a bit. Very well then. What should it be, this whopping, terrific, exploding shocker for Grandma? He would have liked to put a firework banger under her chair, but he didn't have one. He would have liked to have put a long green snake down the back of her dress, but he didn't have a long green snake. He would have liked to put 6 big black rats in the room with her and lock the door, but he didn't have 6 big black rats. As George sat there pondering this interesting problem, his eye fell upon the bottle of Grandma's brown medicine standing on the sideboard. Rotten stuff it seemed to be. 4 times a day a large spoonful it was shovelled into her mouth, and it didn't do her the slightest bit of good. She was always just as horrid after she'd had it as she'd been before. The whole point of medicine surely was to make a person better. If it didn't do that, then it was quite useless. So-ho, thought George suddenly. Aha! Ho-hum! I know exactly what I'll do. I shall make her a new medicine, one that is so strong and so fierce and so fantastic it will either cure her completely or blow off the top of her head. I'll make her a magic medicine, a medicine no doctor in the world has ever made before. George looked at the kitchen clock. It said 10:05. There was nearly an hour left before Grandma's next dose was due at 11. Here we go then, cried George, jumping up from the table. A magic medicine it will be. So give me a bug and a jumping flea. Give me 2 snails and lizards 3. and a slimy squiggler from the sea, and the poisonous sting of a bumblebee, and the juice from the fruit of a jujube tree, and the powdered bone of a wombat's knee, and 100 other things as well, each with a rather nasty smell. I'll stir them up, I'll boil them long, a mixture tough, a mixture strong, and then hey-ho, and down it goes. A nice big spoonful, hold your nose, just gulp it down and have no fear. How do you like it, Granny dear? Will she pop? Will she explode? Will she go flying down the road? Will she go poof in a puff of smoke? Start fizzing like a can of Coke? Who knows? Not I. Let's wait and see. I'm glad it's neither you nor me. Oh, Grandma, if only you knew what I had got in store for you. Chapter 3. George begins to make the medicine. George took an enormous saucepan out of the cupboard and placed it on the kitchen table. "George," came the shrill voice from the next room. "What are you doing?" "Nothing, Grandma," he called out. "You needn't think I can't hear you just because you closed the door. You're rattling the saucepans." "I'm just tidying the kitchen, Grandma." Then there was silence. George had absolutely no doubts whatsoever about how he was going to make his famous medicine. He wasn't going to fool about wondering whether to put in a little bit of this or a little bit of that. Quite simply, he was going to put in everything he could find. There would be no messing about, no hesitating, no wondering whether a particular thing would knock the girl sideways or not. The rule would be this: whatever he saw, if it was runny or powdery or gooey, in it went. Nobody had ever made a medicine like that before. If it didn't actually cure Grandma, then it would anyway cause some exciting results. It would be worth watching. George decided to work his way around the various rooms one at a time and see what they had to offer. He would go first to the bathroom. There were always lots of funny things in the bathroom. So upstairs he went, carrying the enormous 2-handled saucepan before him. In the bathroom he gazed longingly at the famous and dreaded medicine cupboard, but he didn't go near it. It was the only thing in the entire house he was forbidden to touch. He had made solemn promises to his parents about this, and he wasn't going to break them now. There were things in there, they had told him, that could actually kill a person, and although he was out to give Grandma a pretty fiery mouthful, he didn't really want a dead body on his hands. George put the saucepan on the floor and went to work. Number 1 was a bottle labelled Golden Gloss Hair Shampoo. He emptied it into the pan. "That ought to wash her tummy nice and clean," he said. He took a full tube of toothpaste and squeezed out the whole lot of it in one long worm. "Maybe that'll brighten up her horrid brown teeth of hers," he said. There was an aerosol full of Superfoam shaving soap belonging to his father. George loved playing with aerosols. He pressed the button and kept his finger on it until there was nothing left. A wonderful mountain of white foam built up in the giant saucepan. With his fingers he scooped out the contents of a jar of vitamin-enriched face cream. In went a small bottle of scarlet nail varnish. "If the toothpaste doesn't clean her teeth," George says, "then this'll paint them as red as roses." He found another jar of creamy stuff labelled Hair Remover. "Smear it on your legs," it said, "and allow to remain for 5 minutes." George tipped it all into the saucepan. There was a bottle with yellow stuff inside it called Dishworth's Famous Dandruff Cure. In it went. There was something called Brilladent for cleaning false teeth. It was a white powder. In that went too. He found another aerosol can. Nevermore Ponking Deodorant Spray. "Guaranteed," it said, "to keep away unpleasant body smells for the whole day." "She could use plenty of that," George said as he sprayed the entire canful into the saucepan. Liquid Paraffin, the next one was called. It was a big bottle. He hadn't the faintest idea what it did to you, but he poured it in anyway. That, he thought, looking around him, was about all from the bathroom. On his mother's dressing table in the bedroom, George found yet another lovely aerosol can. It was called Helga's Hair Set. Hold 12 inches away from the hair and spray lightly. He squirted the whole lot into the saucepan. He did enjoy squirting those aerosols. There was a bottle of perfume called Flowers of Turnips. It smelled of old cheese. In it went. And in, too, went a large round box of powder. It was called Pink Plaster. There was a powder puff on top, and he threw that in as well for luck. He found a couple of lipsticks. He pulled the greasy red things out of their little cases and added them to the mixture. The bedroom had nothing more to offer, so George carried the enormous saucepan downstairs again and trotted into the laundry room, where the shelves were full of all kinds of household items. The first one he took down was a large box of super white for automatic washing machines. Dirt, it said, will disappear like magic. George didn't know whether Grandma was automatic or not, but she was certainly a dirty old woman. So she'd better have it all, he said, tipping in the whole boxful. Then there was a big tin of Waxwell floor polish. It removes filth and foul messes from your floor and leaves everything shiny bright, it said. George scooped up the orange-coloured waxy stuff out of the tin and plonked it into the pan. There was a round cardboard carton labelled "Flea powder for dogs. Keep well away from the dog's food," it said, "because this powder, if eaten, will make the dog explode." "Good," said George, pouring it all into the saucepan. He found a box of canary seed on the shelf. "Perhaps it will make the old bird sing," he said as it went in. Next, George explored the box with shoe-cleaning materials, brushes and tins and dusters. "Well now," he thought, "Grandma's medicine is brown, so my medicine must also be brown or she'll smell a rat. The way to colour it," he decided, "would be with brown shoe polish." The large tin he chose was called Dark Tan. Splendid! He scooped it all out with an old spoon and plopped it into the pan. He would stir it up later. On his way back to the kitchen, George saw a bottle of gin standing on the sideboard. Grandma was very fond of gin. She was allowed to have a small nip of it every evening. Now he would give her a treat. He would pour in the whole bottle. He did. Back in the kitchen, George put the huge saucepan on the table and went over to the cupboard that served as a larder. The shelves were bulging with bottles and jars of every sort. He chose the following and emptied them one by one into the saucepan. A tin of curry powder, a tin of mustard powder, a bottle of extra hot chili sauce, a tin of black peppercorns, a bottle of horseradish sauce. "There," he said aloud, "that should do it." "George!" came the screechy voice from the next room. "Who are you talking to in there? What are you up to?" "Nothing, Grandma, absolutely nothing," he called back. "Is it time for my medicine yet?" "No, Grandma, not for about half an hour." "Well, just so you don't forget it." "I won't, Grandma," George answered. "I promise I won't." There's no way he's going to forget it, is it? Oh, look. Chapter 4. Animal Pills. At this point, George suddenly had an extra good wheeze. Although the medicine cupboard in the house was forbidden ground, what about the medicines his father kept on the shelf in the shed next to the hen house? The animal medicines. What about those? Nobody had ever told him he mustn't touch them. "Let's face it," George said to himself. "Hairspray and shaving cream and shoe polish are all very well, and they will no doubt cause some splendid explosions inside the old geezer, but what the magic mixture now needs is a touch of the real stuff, real pills and real tonics to give it punch and muscle." George picked up the heavy 3/4 full saucepan and carried it out of the back door. He crossed the farmyard and headed straight for the shed alongside the hen house. He knew his father wouldn't be there. He was out haymaking in one of the meadows. George entered the dusty old shed and put the saucepan on the bench. Then he looked up at the medicine shelf. There were 5 big bottles there. 2 were full of pills, 2 were full of runny stuff, and 1 was full of powder. "I'll use 'em all," George said. "Grandma needs 'em. Boy, does she need 'em." The first bottle he took down contained an orange-coloured powder. The label said, "For chickens with fowl, pest, hen gripe, sore beaks, gammy legs, cockroolitis, egg trouble, broodiness, or loss of feathers. Mix 1 spoonful only with each bucket of feed." "Well," said George aloud to himself as he tipped in the whole bottle, "the old bird won't be losing any feathers after she's had a dose of this." The next bottle he took down had about 500 gigantic purple pills in it. "For horses with hoarse throats," it said on the label. "The horse-throated horse should suck 1 pill twice a day." Do you understand it, Lucy? Do you get it? No, I don't think so. What do you mean? horse, horse. It sounds the same, but it means horse means sore throat, but it's a horse with a sore throat. So it's a horse, horse. Oh, I see. Yes, that is a good one. Grandma may not have a hoarse throat, George said, but she's certainly got a sharp tongue. Maybe they'll cure that instead. Into the saucepan went the 500 gigantic purple pills. Then there was a bottle of thick yellowish liquid. For cows, bulls and bullocks, the label said, will cure cowpox, cow mange, crumpled horns, bad breath in bulls, earache, toothache, headache, hoofache, tailhache and sore udders. That grumpy old cow in the living room has every one of those rotten illnesses, George said. She'll need it all. With a slop and a gurgle, the yellow liquid splashed into the now nearly full saucepan. The next bottle contained a brilliant red liquid. Sheep dip, it said on the label. For sheep with sheep rot and for getting rid of ticks and fleas. Mix 1 spoonful in 1 gallon of water and slosh it all over the sheep. Caution, do not make the mixture any stronger or the wool will fall out and the animal will be naked. Naked? A sheep naked? What? Gosh, I hope I never get sheep dip thrown on me. Then I won't have any fur, and then I'll be naked. Oh my goodness, chocolate button. By gum, said George, how I'd love to walk in and slosh it all over Grandma and watch the ticks and fleas go jumping off her. But I can't. I mustn't. So she'll have to drink it instead. He poured the bright red medicine into the saucepan. The last bottle on the shelf was full of pale green pills. Pig pills, the label announced. For pigs with pork prickles, tender trotters, bristle blight, and swine sickness. Give 1 pill per day. In severe cases, 2 pills may be given, but more than that will make the pig rock and roll. Just the stuff, said George, for that miserable old pig back there in the house. She'll need a very big dose. He tipped all the green pills, hundreds and hundreds of them, into the saucepan. There was an old stick lying on the bench that had been used for stirring paint. George picked it up and started to stir his marvellous concoction. The mixture was as thick as cream, and as he stirred and stirred, many wonderful colours rose up from the depths and blended together. Pinks, blues, greens, yellows and browns. George went on stirring until it was all well mixed, but even so there were still hundreds of pills lying on the bottom that hadn't melted, and there was his mother's splendid powder puff floating on the surface. I shall have to boil it up, George said. 1 good quick boil on the stove is all it needs. And with that he staggered back towards the house with the enormous heavy saucepan. On the way he passed a garage, so he went in to see if he could find any other interesting things. He added the following: 1/2 pint of engine oil to keep Grandma's engine growing smoothly, some antifreeze to keep her radiator from freezing up in the winter, a handful of grease to grease her creaking joints. Then back to the kitchen. Chapter 5. The Cook-Up. In the kitchen, George put the saucepan on the stove and turned up the gas flame underneath it as high as it would go. "George!" came the awful voice from the next room. "It's time for my medicine." "Not yet, Grandma," George called back. "There's still 20 minutes before 11 o'clock. "What mischief are you up to in there now?" Granny screeched. "I hear noises." George thought it best not to answer this one. He found a long wooden spoon in a kitchen drawer and began stirring hard. The stuff in the pot got hotter and hotter. Soon the marvellous mixture began to froth and foam. A rich blue smoke the colour of peacocks rose from the surface of the liquid, and a fiery, fearsome smell filled the kitchen. It made George choke and splutter. It was a smell unlike any he had smelled before. It was a brutal and bewitching smell, spicy and staggering, fierce and frenzied, full of wizardry and magic. Whenever he got a whiff of it up his nose, firecrackers went off in his skull and electric prickles ran down along the back of his legs. It was wonderful to stand there stirring this amazing mixture and to watch it smoking blue and bubbling and frothing and foaming as though it were alive. At one point he could have sworn he saw bright sparks flashing in the swirling foam. And suddenly George found himself dancing around the steaming pot, chanting strange words that came into his head out of nowhere. Fiery broth and witch's brew, foamy froth and witch's blue, fume and spume and spoondrift spray, fizzle, swizzle, shout hooray! Watch it sloshing, swashing, sploshing, hear it hissing, squishing, spissing. Grandma better start to pray. Chapter 6. Brown Paint. George turned off the heat under the saucepan. He must leave plenty of time for it to cool down. When all the steam and froth had gone away, he peered into the giant saucepan to see what colour the great medicine now was. It was a deep and brilliant blue. "It needs more brown in it," George said. "It simply must be brown or she'll get suspicious." George ran outside and dashed into his father's tool shed where all the paints were kept. There was a row of cans on the shelf, all colours, black, green, red, pink, white and brown. He reached for the can of brown. The label simply said, "Dark brown gloss paint, 1 quart." He took a screwdriver and prized off the lid. The can was 3/4 full. He rushed it back to the kitchen. He poured the whole lot into the saucepan. The saucepan was now full to the very brim. Very gently, George stirred the paint into the mixture with a long wooden spoon. Aha! It was all turning brown, a lovely, rich, creamy brown. "Where's that medicine of mine, boy?" came the voice from the living room. "You're forgetting me. You're doing it on purpose. I shall tell your mother." "I'm not forgetting you, Grandma," George called back. "I'm thinking of you all the time, but there are still 10 minutes to go." "You're a nasty little maggot," the voice screeched back. "You're a lazy and disobedient little worm, and you're growing too fast." George fetched the bottle of Grandma's real medicine from the sideboard. He took out the cork and tipped it all down the sink. He then filled the bottle with his own magic mixture by dipping a small jug into the saucepan and using it as a pourer. He replaced the cork. Had it cooled down enough yet? Not quite. He held the bottle under the cold tap for a few minutes. The label came off in the wet, but that didn't matter. He dried the bottle with a dishcloth. All was now ready. This was it. The great moment had arrived. "Medicine time, Grandma," he called out. "I should hope so too," came the grumpy reply. The silver tablespoon in which the medicine was always given lay ready on the kitchen sideboard. George picked it up. Holding the spoon in one hand and the bottle in the other, he advanced into the living room. Chapter 7. Grandma Gets the Medicine. Grandma sat hunched in her chair by the window. The wicked little eyes followed George closely as he crossed the room towards her. "You're late," she snapped. "I don't think I am, Grandma." "Don't interrupt me in the middle of a sentence," she shouted. "But you'd finished your sentence, Grandma." "There you go again," she cried. "Always interrupting and arguing. You really are a tiresome little boy. What's the time?" "It's exactly 11 o'clock, Grandma." "You're lying as usual. Stop talking so much and give me my medicine. Shake the bottle first, then pour it into the spoon and make sure it's a whole spoonful." "Are you going to gulp it down in one go?" George asked her. "Or will you sip it?" "What I do is none of your business," the old woman said. "Fill the spoon." As George removed the cork and began very slowly to pour the thick brown stuff into the spoon, he couldn't help thinking back upon the mad and marvellous things that had gone into the making of this crazy stuff. The shaving soap, the hair remover, the dandruff cure, the automatic washing powder, the flea powder for the dogs, the shoe polish, the black pepper, the horseradish sauce, and all the rest of them, not to mention the powerful animal pills and powders and liquids, and the brown paint. "Open your mouth wide, Grandma," he said, "and I'll pop it in." The old hag opened her small wrinkled mouth, showing disgusting pale brown teeth. "Here we go," George cried out. "Swallow it down." He pushed the spoon well into her mouth and tipped the mixture down her throat. Then he stepped back to watch the result. It was worth watching. Grandma yelled, "Owie!" "Hooray!" and her whole body shot up whoosh into the air. It was exactly as though someone had pushed an electric wire through the underneath of her chair and switched on the current. Up she went like a jack-in-a-box, and she didn't come down. She stayed there, suspended in mid-air, about 2 feet up, sitting in a sitting position, but rigid now, frozen, quivering, the eyes bulging, the hair standing straight up on end. "Is something wrong, Grandma?" George asked her politely. "Are you all right?" Suspended up there in space, the old girl was beyond speaking. The shock that George's marvellous mixture had given her must have been tremendous. You'd have thought she'd swallowed a red-hot poker the way she shot off from the chair. Then down again she came with a plop, back into her seat. "Call the fire brigade!" she shouted suddenly. "My stomach's on fire!" "It's just the medicine, Grandma," George said. "It's good strong stuff." "Fire!" the old woman yelled. "Fire in the basement! Get a bucket! Man the hoses! Do something quick!" "Cool it, Grandma," George said, but he got a bit of a shock when he saw the smoke coming out of her mouth and out of her nostrils. Clouds of black smoke were coming out of her nose and blowing around the room. "By golly, you really are on fire," George said. "Of course I'm on fire!" she yelled. "I'll be burned to a crisp! I'll be fried to a frizzle! I'll be boiled like a beetroot!" George ran into the kitchen and came back with a jug of water. "Open your mouth, Grandma," he cried. He could hardly see her for the smoke, but he managed to pour half a jugful down her throat. A sizzling sound, the kind you get if you hold a hot frying pan under a cold tap, came up from the deep in Grandma's stomach. The old hag bucked and shied and snorted. She gasped and gurgled. Spouts of water came shooting out of her, and the smoke cleared away. "The fire's out," George announced proudly. "You'll be all right now, Grandma." "All right!" she yelled. "Who's all right? There's Jackie Jumpers in my tummy. There's squigglers in my belly. There's bangers in my bottom." She began bouncing up and down in the chair. Quite obviously she was not very comfortable. "You'll find it's doing you a lot of good, that medicine, Grandma," George said. "Good?" she screamed. "Doing me good? It's killing me!" Then she began to bulge. She was swelling. She was puffing up all over. She was someone was pumping her up. That's how it looked. Was she going to explode? Her face was turning from purple to green. But wait, she had a puncture somewhere. George could hear the hiss of escaping air. She stopped swelling. She was going down. She was slowly getting thinner again, shrinking back and back slowly to her shrivelly old self. "How's things, Grandma?" George said. No answer. Then a funny thing happened. Grandma's body gave a sudden sharp twist and a sudden sharp jerk, and she flipped herself clear out of the chair and landed neatly on 2 feet on the carpet. "That's terrific, Grandma!" George cried. "You haven't stood up like that for years. Look at you. You're standing up all on your own, and you're not even using a stick." Grandma didn't even hear him. The frozen pop-eyed look was back with her again now. She was miles away in another world. Marvellous medicine, George told himself. He found it fascinating to stand there, watching what it was doing to the old hag. What next, he wondered. He soon found out. Suddenly she began to grow. It was quite slow at first, just a very gradual inching upwards. Up, up, up. Inch by inch, getting taller and taller, about an inch every few seconds. And in the beginning George didn't notice it. But when she had passed the 5'6" mark and was going up towards being 6 feet tall, George gave a jump and shouted, "Hey, Grandma, you're growing! You're going up! Hang on, Grandma, you'd better stop now or you'll be hitting the ceiling." But Grandma didn't stop. It was a truly fantastic sight, this ancient, scrawny old woman getting taller and taller, longer and longer, thinner and thinner, as though she were a piece of elastic being pulled upwards by invisible hands. When the top of her head actually touched the ceiling, George thought she was bound to stop. But she didn't. There was a sort of scrunching noise, and bits of plaster and cement came raining down. "Hadn't Hadn't you better stop now, Grandma? George said. Daddy's just had this whole room repainted. But there was no stopping her now. Soon her head and shoulders had completely disappeared through the ceiling, and she was still going. George dashed upstairs to his own bedroom, and there she was coming up through the floor like a mushroom. Whoopee! She shouted, finding her voice at last. Hallelujah! Here I come! Steady on, Grandma, George said. With a hey nonny no and up we go, she shouted. Just watch me grow. This is my room, George said. Look at the mess you're making. Terrific medicine, she cried. Give me some more. She's dotty as a doughnut, George thought. Come on, boy, give me some more, she yelled. Dish it out, I'm slowing down. George was still clutching the medicine bottle in one hand and the spoon in the other. Oh well, he thought, why not? He poured out a second dose and popped it into her mouth. Owie! She screamed, and up she went again. Her feet were still on the floor downstairs in the living room, but her head was moving quickly towards the ceiling of the bedroom. I'm on my way now, boy, she called down to George. Just watch me go. There's the attic above you, Grandma, George called out. I'd keep out of there. It's full of bugs and bogles. Crash! The old girl's head went through the ceiling as if it were butter. George stood in his bedroom, gazing at the shambles. There was a big hole in the floor and another in the ceiling, and sticking up like a post between the two was the middle part of Grandma. Her legs were in the room below, her head in the attic. I'm still going, came the screechy voice from above. Give me another dose, my boy. Let's go through the roof. No, Grandma, no, George called back. You're busting up the whole house. To heck with the house, she shouted. I want some fresh air. I haven't been outside for 20 years. By golly, she is going through the roof, George told himself. He ran downstairs. He rushed out of the back door into the yard. It could be simply awful, he thought, if she bashed up the roof as well. His father would be furious, and George, would get the blame. He had made the medicine. He had given her too much. Don't come through the roof, Grandma, he prayed. Please don't.